Wonderful. Okay, I can get going then. Anyway, it's really a pleasure to be back here again. It hasn't really been very long. I think it's just been 9 or 10 months that I gave what is the first in a series of talks I've created about bird evolution. And this is part 2. And the focus is on birds who lived at the time of the classic dinosaurs. So birds who lived with other dinosaurs. And I'm going to start off by giving a really quick review of some of the main points I made in my first talk, because it'll make the second part of the talk make more sense. Whoops, and it always takes a second to do the very first one. There we go. Okay, one of the things we covered in the last talk, which really focused on the evidence that birds are in fact living dinosaurs, was to compare some of the most salient features of birds with dinosaurs, and there's, as you can see here, pretty much 100% overlap, and then contrasted that by comparing birds to other living vertebrates, and you can see the difference. Birds are much, much, much more similar to dinosaurs than they are to any other living vertebrates. We also talked about the fact that a lot of people, when they hear the word dinosaur, think that just refers to any old reptile that lived a long time ago, but that's not true. Reptiles are dinosaurs are an order of reptiles. So that would be akin to saying a primate or a passerine or an ungulate. There were lots and lots and lots of reptiles who lived during the age of dinosaurs that were not in fact dinosaurs. So here's an example. Here's a giant crocodile from that era. Here's a pterosaur. I picked this one, Coatcolus, because it's in fact the largest flying creature ever, 35-foot wingspan. So there's never been a bird as big as this guy. Not a reptile, but not a dinosaur. There were also plesiosaurs who look like the Loch Ness Monster. They were reptiles during the age of dinosaurs, but are not dinosaurs. So to say a creature is a dinosaur really is telling you that it's got some very specific characteristics. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but I do want to show you one of them. Here's a Stegosaurus. Most people recognize Stegosaurus. And if you look at him, you can see that his legs go straight down under his body, the way yours does, or the way a horse's does, or a tiger's does. In contrast, all other reptiles that have legs, because snakes don't have legs, have splayed legs. Whether you're talking about a lizard or a crocodile or a turtle, their legs go out and make a 90-degree angle. And that actually has a lot of implications. But anyway, that's if you're ever at a museum and there's a diorama, you can always tell whether you're looking at a dinosaur or not, because the legs will go straight down under the body. Now, we can say that birds evolved from dinosaurs, but then the real natural next question is, well, which dinosaurs? And the answer is that birds evolved from a very ancient, a very long-lived superfamily of dinosaurs called theropods. They lived all over the planet. They were whoppingly successful. They were very diverse. We know of more than 1,100 species of theropods. So there are lots and lots and lots of theropods. And basically, these are the big two-legged carnivores, where they include the big two-legged carnivores. So T-Rex and Allosaurus and Velociraptors, those were all theropods. And frankly, I think that's part of the problem. The reason some people find it hard to imagine that birds evolved from dinosaurs is because when they think of a dinosaur, they think of something like this, Gigantosaurus. Now, he was a theropod from South America, from Chile and Argentina. He's actually even bigger than T-Rex. But when you look at a guy like this, you say, how do you get to a canary, from an animal that looks like this? But this isn't the only way that theropods looked. What if instead of imagining something like Gigantosaurus, you imagine Gigantoraptor? This is a creature from Mongolia, actually very misnamed because he's not in fact a raptor, smaller than the previous dinosaur, only 25 feet long, 16 feet tall. But now we're beginning to look at something that looks a little bit more like a bird, and you can more easily imagine that birds evolved from something like this. We can go one step further. What if the theropod that comes to mind when I say theropod looked like this? This is a good theropod too, Changuiraptor. This creature was about 4 feet long. It could fly very well. We'll look at him again in a little bit. But my point is that birds evolved from theropods, but theropods included quite a number of creatures that were much more bird-like than T-Rex. And by the way, T-Rex was fully feathered, so he was actually more bird-like than you might think too. But you know, nobody thinks that you get a canary from, you know, one of these big giant theropods. It's rather that some of these smaller, more bird-like theropods gave rise to dinosaurs. Now, this is a really complicated slide, and I don't expect you to remember any of it. My big point is that if you start with a classic dinosaur and end up with a bird, traits evolved in a particular order. But what I want you to notice is this top line, which has brown. These are features that aren't just found in theropods. They're found widely throughout all of the dinosaur order. So, you know, in the stegosauruses and hadrosauruses and apatosauruses and ankylosauruses, you find animals with feathers, with their legs under the body. I told you that's definitional to dinosaurs, that were bipedal. When you get to these middle 2 rows that are kind of in a gray blue, that's these are the theropod rows. So theropods in general had a number of characteristics that we strongly associate with birds. They had hollow bones. Even T-Rex had hollow bones. They have a wishbone, which is a fused clavicle that gives strength to the breast, you know, to support the breast muscles. They had reduced numbers of fingers on their hand. They had a very bird-like pelvis. They could fly. We're going to come back to that. Lots and lots of theropods that weren't birds could fly. And they had a pygostyle. A pygostyle, if you don't know the term, is, you know how birds sometimes look as if they have a very long tail. Think about something like a peacock. But, you know, 95% of that is feather. There's only a little tiny little stump that's actually flesh and blood, bone and muscle. That's the pygostyle, that little stump that attaches the tail feathers to the body. And then finally, it's only the bottom line here in gold that these traits only occur in true birds. So clawless wings, keeled sternum, and a completely toothless beak. And not all true birds even have these. But I just wanted to show you that many of the important characteristics that birds have either are very common among theropods or very common among dinosaurs in general. Now, what this trait is made to illustrate is the biggest problem I have talking about this topic. And that is, people always want to know whether a creature is a bird or a dinosaur. Well, imagine the yellow is birds and the red is dinosaurs. And I show you a creature that's right up here. Everybody says it's a bird. And if I show you a creature that's down here, everybody could say, oh, that's a dinosaur. But the problem is, what if I show you a creature about here? And I say, is it a bird or a dinosaur? And you say, well, it's really neither. It's kind of halfway between the two. And I say, you're not allowed to say that. You either have to pick bird or dinosaur. And this is the situation we're in. What we have is a very smooth fossil record without large gaps. I mean, it's just a pretty smooth continuum on a lot of traits. And it's really pretty arbitrary to say, well, here's the line. Here, you know, above this line, you're a bird, below it, it's a dinosaur. Other people would say, no, that's up here. And so there's disagreement. And in fact, there's a lot of creatures that, in my opinion, we should call half and halves. And that's what I'm going to call them, because the truth is, they don't have a fully bird trait. They don't have a fully classical dinosaur trait. They have something halfway in the middle. So I call these guys half and halves. And there were lots and lots and lots of half and half creatures, like this one. So again, no missing link, no large jumps in the fossil record, just gradual changes in features going from point A to point B. And that's a very new thing for me to be able to say. And it's all because, as I think Vicki mentioned, there have been 2 major new fossil deposits discovered in China within the past 20 years or so. And what's really special about these fossil deposits is that the silt that was deposited was so fine and so lightweight that birds could fossilize. Birds aren't good candidates for fossilization because they've got very thin, light, hollow bones. So they usually just get squished and disappear. But these two sites, these two beds are just incredibly rich in true birds and half creatures that are a lot like birds. Okay, so again, what I'm trying to say is if you look at evolution over time, first there's a period where there's only what are really classical dinosaurs. Then there's a period where the dinosaurs plus what I'm calling these half creatures, which are kind of midway between dinos and birds. And then there's a long period of time where there's dinos and halves and birds. I say this because I know from talking to people that when you say that birds evolved from dinosaurs, what people imagine is that, okay, dinosaurs were around for a long time. Right at the end of dinosaurs, you got some birds, you know, but it's right at the very end. And what I want to emphasize that it's absolutely not true. That's not the right way to think about it. Dinosaurs and half creatures and birds coexisted for a very long time. Then there was the mass extinction event 66, 65 million years ago. An asteroid hit the Earth, and only true birds were left. All the others died out. 75% of all animals died out, and only a few birds, most birds didn't make it, only a few birds survived. And that's why we don't have haves or classic dinosaurs anymore. Okay, so here's the timeline. If you look at the age of dinosaurs, it's usually divided into three periods: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous, really based on the kind of vegetation there was. In the Triassic, there was generally pretty much only low plants. There wasn't a lot of food around for dinosaurs. They were smaller. In the Jurassic, you've got towering conifers and tree ferns and palm trees, or trees like palm trees. And then in the Cretaceous, you have flowering plants, and food got a lot richer and dinosaurs continued to get larger. Anyway, so true classic dinosaurs existed from 245 million years ago to 65 million years ago. These half creatures that are midway between birds and dinosaurs appeared about 200 million years ago, and they lasted all the way till 65 million years ago. The first birds showed up right at the very end of the Jurassic, just a little bit before the Jurassic ended, and of course they continued through the Cretaceous and on into modern times. So let's start by talking about the birds of the Jurassic. Now again, they only showed up at the very end of the Jurassic, but, and I like this picture because it gives the impression that I want. The skies were very full back then because there are some dinosaurs that could fly. These half creatures could fly. Pterosaurs could fly. There were insects that could fly. Birds were not the first animals to conquer the sky by any means. So when these first birds began to evolve at the very end of the Jurassic, you know, like I said, the skies were already chock full of other creatures. And again, that's not something I think a lot of people really appreciate. So let's talk about the characteristics of these Jurassic birds. First off, we only know of two species. There are undoubtedly more, but we have not found them. There are only two types of skeletons that we know of birds from the Jurassic. So I'll talk about those two birds. Again, a continuum from other dinosaurs. They're not very different than dinosaurs and true classic dinosaurs in many ways. And there are many traits. I mean, this part of what makes this all complicated is that why do you call something a bird rather than a dinosaur? There are at least 16 traits you can look at that you can measure, and people say, well, if it's bigger than this, it's one, and if it's smaller than this, it's the other. Most of these traits are traits you don't want to know about because you've got to be an anatomist to really get into it. I mean, it has to do with the angle this bone touches that bone, and what angle does this process come off of a bone, and which bones are fused, and how early in the animal's life do they fuse. I mean, it's real technical stuff, but there are lots and lots of traits that are changing as you move from classic dinosaurs to birds, not just one or two things. Again, I want to emphasize that we've got two birds, but there are lots and lots of small, feathered, lightweight flying dinos around during the Jurassic. I also wanted to tell you that both known Jurassic birds were dead ends. They are not ancestors of modern birds. They were birds. They're classified as birds, but they're not the great-great-great-great-grandparents of any modern birds. And this makes sense. If you just differentiate, if you've just evolved from dinos, you're going to retain many of the features that classic dinosaurs have. So let's talk about what those features are. Okay, so there are 5 visible. Again, there's all these internal anatomical stuff that you don't want to go to, but visibly, there are 5 classic dinosaur traits that are retained by Jurassic birds, and we'll go through each one of them. But they're the killing claw, leg wings, teeth, a long bony tail, and claws on true wings, the forewings. Okay, and just to repeat and emphasize again, while early birds had lots of classic dino traits, dinos had lots of bird-like traits, including feathers, the ability to fly, a hard beak, thin hollow bones, a wishbone, and partial loss of teeth. So again, there's just kind of this mush in the middle of lots and lots of creatures that, it depends upon where you're pointing on its body. It either looks like a bird or it looks like a classic dinosaur. Okay, well, let's go through these 5 traits. The first is the killing claw. So on the right, you can see Velociraptor. On the left, you can see a close-up of his foot. And this is what I mean by a killing claw. Killing claw is the second toe, and it has a claw that's much bigger than the other claws and usually more curved than the other claws, and it can be lifted. Okay, you can put it down or pick it up. And we're pretty sure that it was used to both hold down a prey animal, when think about a hawk eating or an eagle eating, holding food in its talons when it's ripping animals apart, or just to actually do the disemboweling when it's trying to kill a prey animal. So Velociraptors had really nice killing claws. What do I want to say about it? Yes, we do know that Velociraptor had feathers. We've got skin impressions. They weren't very good feathers, but they were feathers. And regardless of what you saw in the movie Jurassic Park, those movies, it was only about the size of a big turkey. It wasn't as big as the movie. So killing claw. The second characteristic that Jurassic birds had are leg wings. And so did these half and half dinosaurs I keep talking about. And here's a beautiful example of a leg wing. Here's the true wing, and here's the leg wing. Okay, and when we say leg wing, what we mean is that there are flight feathers on the leg. Okay, true flight feathers, often asymmetrical flight feathers on the legs. You can also see the killing claw here, that big curved claw right there. Let's see, why did they have leg wings? Why did these show up? Well, the shoulder joint of these early birds was not as sophisticated as the shoulder joint in modern birds. Plus, their tails weren't as maneuverable as the tails of modern birds. And so all in all, they were pretty clumsy compared to modern birds. And it was thought that having this extra pair of wings helped them, maneuver, helped them dodge around trees as they were flying, helped them, zero in on their prey. So it's for maneuverability. That's why they existed. What do I want to say? Okay, teeth. All right, this is another, Microraptor is a genus, so there are lots of species in here. This is another different Microraptor than one I just showed. Microraptors were really numerous. They were really common. There's lots of different species, and the individuals within each species were very numerous, many of them. So very, very common type of dinosaur. So anyway, you can see that this Microraptor has teeth. And they're very alligator-like teeth. They're simple pegs, and that's usually associated with fish eating. So these guys probably ate fish, the size of a crow. So just an example of, I think I forgot to say this. I'm starting with dinosaurs, showing you these dinosaur-like traits, and I'll show you them in birds. Okay, here's yet another Microraptor. Here's its partial beak. You can see the leg wings. You can see the killing claw. You can also see claws on the end of its true wings. Okay, long bony tail. Okay, a long bony tail. This animal, genuine long, was another theropod. It was about 5 feet long. It couldn't fly. Its arms are too short to support its weight. By the way, a little bit of a side light here. Feathers evolved long before there was flight. There are many, many, many dinosaurs that there's no way they flew, including T-Rex, that were covered with feathers. Feathers were for warmth, they were for display, and later on they got used for flight. So there are lots and lots of flightless animals that have very nice feathers. This guy, Genuine Long, happens to be the largest dino with really great wings. Really great wings, meaning really nice flight feathers and really dense flight feathers. Slightly bigger than a condor, but twice as heavy. Again, no way this guy flew. And you can also see what a mouthful of teeth he has. Doesn't have reduced teeth. And here's what he looks. This is what you really find. You know, you can reconstruct them, but this is what you really find. Clawed wings. Another one of those traits, and you can see the claws here. I did want to talk about Caudopteryx because there's an interesting story about them that has to do with birds in flight. There were actually 2 different species of Caudopteryx. They were both more or less peacock-sized. In some ways, I mean, this is a classic half and half dinosaur because in some ways they were very, very advanced, very, very modern. Birds generally have fewer vertebrae than reptiles. This guy has a relatively few vertebrae. It has what's called uncinate processes on their ribs, which is a kind of support that only birds have. The feather arrangement's very modern. It had symmetrical flight feathers, and it even ate stones. It has gastroliths. So, you know, in some ways it's very modern. In other ways, it was really, really archaic. It has very, very primitive shoulder joint, very, very primitive pelvis. The body feathers were very primitive compared to a lot of other animals at the time. So this is a good example of a half and half creature. Again, you know, we can reconstruct it, but this is what they actually find. You can see that nice tuft of tail feathers right there. And that's just what its skeleton looks like. But here's what I wanted to get to. Tailory, just a few years ago, built a model of the skeleton of Caudopteryx and just moved it along a treadmill, or just ran a treadmill, and so it walked. But when it walked, what they discovered is that the wings passively flapped. I mean, they weren't making the wings flapped. It was the airflow when this creature moved that caused the wings to flap. And the reason that's interesting and important, just people who are interested in the evolution of birds are always interested in, well, birds can fly. Did they become flyers because they started gliding and only later did they flap? Or were they flappers who only later started gliding? And this is actually the first evidence of birds of creatures who absolutely couldn't have glided, way too heavy to glide, but who flapped. And so we already knew that there were some birds who glide before they flapped. Now we know there are at least some birds that flapped before they could glide. And so it looks like the ability to fly probably evolved multiple times and in different ways. So it's an aside, but I thought it was a cool one. Okay. Well, now let's get to birds. I said there were only 2 birds in the Jurassic. Here they are. The first one is probably well known to you, Archaeopteryx, which until very recently was considered the oldest true bird. This was an incredibly important fossil find. It was found in 1861. The first one was found in Germany. And the reason it was so important is Darwin had published on the Origin of Species in 1859. So this was only 2 years later. And it was considered incredible evidence for the theory of evolution, because this is a creature, they called it a bird, we label it as a bird, but it's really a half and half creature, where you really can see this is the missing link between birds and dinosaurs. So it was really, really, really important. Again, from the very late Jurassic, about 150 million years ago. It is not a relative of modern birds, okay? It's a dead end. About the size of a raven. I have to tell you that if this creature were found today rather than in the 1800s, there is no doubt we would call it a dinosaur. Our standards have gotten much tougher in what we're willing to call a bird. because it was historically called a bird. We continue to call it a bird, but there are a lot of creatures that we now label dinosaurs that are more advanced in every way you can name than Archaeopteryx, which again just shows you how messy this whole topic is. Archaeopteryx could fly, but probably not very well. And the reason we say that is because you can look at the shoulders and see that it could, when it did a downstroke, it had power, but when it started lifting its wings on the upstroke, there was no power. So it probably flew a lot like a goldfinch, you know, kind of going up and down and up and down, because they could only do power on the downstroke. So it wasn't a very good flyer. Its brain to body ratio is larger than many contemporary dinosaurs, though nowhere near the size of birds. There's some thought now that it was a nocturnal hunter, in the way an owl would be. That's because of the structure of its eye socket that suggests this. So Archaeopteryx, you can just see here in this diagram, it's got nice long flight feathers. It's still got claws on the end of its wings. It's got lots and lots of teeth. It has a bony tail. It's down to 3 toes. I mean, so it's a mixture of traits, some dinosaur-like, some more modern bird-like. Its brain, as I said, is larger. This is a cast of its brain than many dinosaurs, or brain-body ratio is larger than many contemporary dinosaurs. But unlike in birds, the excess volume is not in its visual lobes, its optic lobes. Rather, it's all in the olfactory bulb, which is again part of the evidence that's making some people say it must have been nocturnal because it's hunting by smell. We have diurnal birds that hunt by smell, so I'm not sure that does it, but anyway, that's the suggestion. And that's, again, what it really looks like. And you can imagine when paleontologists found that, and these are clearly feathers, you can't pretend these aren't feathers. It was like, oh my God, we have found a 150 million year old bird. Last picture of Archaeopteryx. This is its correct coloration. They can now do biochemical analyses and also look at the microanatomy of bones to know what color birds' feathers are. And Archaeopteryx was colored kind of like a magpie, mostly black, but with kind of whiter feathers on the wings and tail. Well, the oldest true bird that we know of nowadays is this guy. I mean, because in 20 years we'll have found some others, but right now is Aurornis zhui. This is an ancestor, actually, or believed to be an ancestor of Archaeopteryx. It's 10 million years older, so 160 million years old. And quite a bit more primitive in lots of ways. About the size of a pheasant, lived in the forest, couldn't fly because it doesn't have flight feathers. It only has soft, downy feathers. It still has a long, bony tail. Don't really know a lot about it because it was a very incomplete, only incomplete skeletons have been found. But again, believed to be a direct ancestor of Archaeopteryx. And that's what it looked like when you actually find it. Okay, well, birds just got going at the end of the Jurassic. They really took off in the Cretaceous. Okay, there was an explosion of true birds in the Cretaceous. The Cretaceous starts about 145 million years ago. Virtually all of the birds who lived during the Cretaceous died off in the massive extinction event that killed off almost everything else, including all the dinosaurs. We know of more than 150 species of birds that come from the Cretaceous. So, you know, there's a lot one could talk about. Again, especially if you look at the really early ones, they retain many of these 5 primitive traits that I just talked about. I mean, you know, this is early in the Cretaceous. They tended to go away, most of those traits, as time wore on. Okay. If you look at birds in the Cretaceous, there's basically 3 different body plans, okay? One body plan looks a lot like a passerine, okay? I mean, it just looks, you know, it's got a flat tail, it's got perching feet. So we've kind of got passerine-esque birds. We also have birds that have a long bony tail with a tuft of feathers at the end. Generally, these are pheasanty sized. And then we've got these guys. again, in a lot of ways, they look like just kind of typical, normal passerine-ish birds, but they have these funky tail feathers. And a lot of birds back then had these funky tail feathers. I'd go so far as to say most birds back then had funky tail feathers. And the funky tail feathers either came in a pair, so there were 2 of them, or sometimes there are 4 of them. But they're really dramatic, different tail feathers. Now, birds with those kind of tail feathers do exist today, but they're rare and, you know, few and far between. Let me just show you some examples of modern birds with funky tail feathers. So you've got this one. This is the ribbon-tailed Astrapia, which is a type of bird of paradise from New Guinea. That's funky tail. The pin-tailed Whydah from South Africa, which is a finch, and here you can see it's of the 4 funky feather variety. There's a booted racket-tail hummer from South America. So this kind of tail that we occasionally see nowadays was just uber mega common in the Cretaceous. Lots and lots and lots and lots of birds have these funky tails, and I wish I could tell you why, but I can't. I don't think anybody knows. And I just wanted to point out that, again, just to keep emphasizing to you that there's not a big difference really between birds and half and dinosaurs. This guy, Epidextrix, is a dinosaur from about the same time period. Definitely a dinosaur, but look, he has 4 funky tail feathers too. So that is not a trait that you only could find in birds. There were some dinosaurs that had them too. In fact, he's just a little bit older than the birds I was just showing you. So these are actually the earliest, this is the earliest example of ornamental tail feathers that we found. Okay, what do I want to say? Why did I show this guy? I remember, Cryptovolans. I made the point before that if we found Archaeopteryx today, we would call it a dinosaur, not a bird. And Cryptovolans was only found in about 2008, 2009. It is in every way you can name more advanced than Archaeopteryx. I mean, feature by feature, this guy is quite more bird-like than Archaeopteryx, but he's classified as a dinosaur because our standards have gone up. Again, the right thing to say is it's a half and half, but we don't have that category. I mentioned before that one characteristic that differentiates birds from reptiles and other dinosaurs are ulcinate processes, and you can see them right here. Birds have really huge flight muscles, most of them because they fly. They've got light hollow bones. In order to make their ribs stronger, the ribs are kind of connected to each other with these crossbars. Those are the processes I'm talking about. This is definitely a bird trait, you know, and so it's considered advanced if a creature has this trait. Cryptovolans that I just showed you had them. Also, birds have fewer ribs than reptiles. They lose their belly ribs because the belly ribs don't really help support the wings very much. Cryptovolans had no belly ribs, whereas Archaeopteryx did. So just some example. All right, let's talk about Cretaceous. Oh, no, one more. This is still a dinosaur, the Lorabondoc. Very end of the Cretaceous. This is right at the end of the Age of Dinosaurs that this guy lived. And I look at him and he's so bird-like that I always imagine he must be, you know, 6, 7 inches long, a little guy, 6 feet long, very advanced, except for having tiny little claws on his wings. This guy is really, 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 really bird-like. But again, we've changed our standards, so we call him a dinosaur, and it has to do with how the bones in his ankles and legs are fused. Now I want to switch to birds. Okay. This is an important bird, Archaeopteryx, because it's the oldest known bird in the modern bird lineage, or if you prefer the term clade, the modern bird clade. So this is an ancestor of modern birds. That's why it's called an ornithomorph. That's the clade that led to modern birds. From about 130 million years ago, what do I want to say about it? He had a fan-shaped tail. He has a very strong wishbone. He has an alula. We hadn't seen one of those before. That's the little thumb that birds have right at the crook of their wing that helped them maneuver. So we know that he was very maneuverable and a very good flyer. He had naked legs. Most half and half creatures did not. Really nice flight feathers, crest. This guy's about 6 inches tall or so. In a lot of ways, if you took his feathers off and looked at him, he looks a lot like a plover, more like a plover than anything else. His feet in particular are very plover-like, and the legs. So the belief is, and given where he was found also, is that he was a shorebird that waded in shallow water, you know, poking into the mud for food. And that's a point I really should emphasize. Again, when I talk to people and you talk about bird evolution, I think they think that the earliest birds were like robins. I mean, robins and sparrows are like the most classic bird, and then birds that are more unusual evolved from them. But that's not the way it is. If you look at all the oldest modern birds in the modern lineage, virtually all of them were shore or water dwelling. They were either in the water or they were on the water edge, not little passerines up in trees. Okay. I just want to point out with this guy, I'm going too slowly, so I've got to skip some things. The reason I put him in here, Jangornis means intermediate bird, is that this is a reduced tail and a pygostyle. This bird is newer than this bird, who has a pygostyle, doesn't have any sort of projection back there, which just shows that losing the bony tail happened more than once during bird evolution. Okay, here's where I had to get to. Forget the very beginning of the Cretaceous. If you look throughout the bulk of the Cretaceous, the bulk of the last part of the Age of Dinosaurs, there were 3 families of birds that you see more than anything else. There were occasional other birds that weren't one of these 3, but most of the birds you'd find during the Cretaceous, except for the very beginning, were one of these types of birds. The largest of the families, the most numerous of the families, were the enantiorniths. These were birds that lived on land, largely in the forest. Most of them could fly. But I'm Xing them out because though they were the dominant, if you say what's the dominant bird family in the Cretaceous, the answer is enantiorniths. They are not related to modern birds. On the other hand, the other 2 families are. So one of them, and we're going to go over these, are the hesperonyths. These were flightless swimmers. Think loon, for example, or penguin, something more like that. And ichthyorniths, which were flying shorebirds like gulls or terns. And they were fish eaters. So let's talk about these. Let's start with the enantiorniths, because these were the most numerous birds during the Cretaceous. More than 80 species have been identified. And these are the most diverse, not only the most numerous, but the most diverse of all the Cretaceous birds. They could fly very well. They could fly as well as modern birds, but we know they're not ancestors of modern birds because their shoulder joint is all wrong. It's the opposite of a modern bird. And even though I'm going to use the hip as an example, I think this is a good analogy. Think about your hip. Your femur, your leg bone, has a ball on it that fits into the socket of your hip, okay? If it were opposite, it would have the ball of your hip bone fit into the socket of your femur, okay? These are reverse of modern birds. It's the shoulder joint, not the hip joint, but it's exactly the opposite. Where it bulges, it goes in. Where it goes in, it bulges. And so we know that they're not related to modern birds. These birds were the first type of bird that had worldwide distribution. They were found on every continent except Antarctica. They ate every diet. And they all died out when the dinosaurs did. An interesting thing is that for every one of the species, and for a lot of the species of enantiorniths, we don't know, we haven't found any nests. We don't know what their nests look like. But for the ones that we have, they all bury them, like Australian brush turkey, like Megapoda. They buried their eggs underground and covered them with a lot of dirt. And that's just, you know, that was the way they kept their eggs warm. You know, it's just kind of an interesting fact about them. There's just a good picture of one. Again, you can see this is one that has a funky tail. It's still got little claws on the end of their wings. The traits that hung around, the primitive traits that hung around longest are clawed wings and a few teeth. Okay, just a couple of teeth often in the jaws. Just showing you some of these because it's so cool. Here's another one, and again, it's got the funky tail. But a number of these birds, because they're so small, have been caught in amber. And so you can see exactly what their color is. You can see exactly what their size is. You can tell that they lived in the forest, you know, because they get mummified and well preserved. So here's one example. That this is from Myanmar, this bird about 100 million years old. Here's another one. This was found just a few months ago. This is actually a hatchling undergoing its first molt. It's bigger than the previous bird. It's 3 inches long. It's a precocial bird. And, you know, boy, if you found that, you'd think you had a baby robin if you didn't, you know, look too close. So again, enantiorniths are the dominant birds during the latter part of the age of dinosaurs. Okay. Oh, this one was just discovered, the most recently discovered enantiornith. Note the funky tail, but he's unusual because he's got this really strange beak. It's very big, very scythe-shaped. There were no birds at that time before this one was found with a beak like that. But more interestingly, it's not formed out of the same bones that all other birds that we've ever found have their bills formed out of. And so he just kind of hangs out there. But he is an enantiornith, and we just found him a couple of months ago. All right, my favorite from back then, second family, are the Hesperorniths. And I really like these guys. They're a highly specialized family of aquatic birds, definitely very close to the ancestors in the line of modern birds, just a tad newer than the enantiorniths. The reason I like them so much is they're the only dinosaurs, because remember, birds are dinosaurs, that colonized the ocean. Though there were a lot of reptiles in the ocean, like plesiosaurs and mosasaurs and ichthyosaurs, those aren't dinosaurs. The Hesperorniths were the only dinosaurs that ever colonized the ocean. And in some ways, you can make a case when you start looking at their anatomy that this is the family that's closest to modern birds. You can also make a case that they're not, but there's at least some reason to believe that they're very closely related to modern birds. 60 species of them. They lived in the sea, they lived in lakes, they lived in rivers, but only in the Northern Hemisphere. They were all around the world, but only in the Northern Hemisphere. They're all very good swimmers, clearly carnivorous. Most of them had only vestigial wings, or even like no wings, and so we know they're flightless. You can see here how far back their legs are set on their body. We associate that with birds that spend all their time in the water. They've got grebe-like toes. I'll show you them in a minute. They had an extra joint on their bottom jaw, which let them move the front of their jaw down and probably, you know, get rid of fish that were hooked on their teeth. Really, just really cool birds. Here's a construction of one. When they were first discovered, people thought they were loons because their legs were set so far back on their body, but we now know that they're not related to loons. For one thing, they're in the wrong hemisphere. Just a sampling of them. There were 60 species, so this isn't all of them. But the littlest ones were about 1 foot long. The biggest ones about 6 feet long. So quite a variety of them. There's its foot, which rather than being webbed is lobed. The toes are lobed. And you know, this helps you be a good swimmer, just like here's a coot foot. You can see they swim using their lobed feet. And again, I really like this image of the bird because you can see how very far back its legs are set on their body, set so far back that they probably couldn't walk on land. And again, we've got modern birds that have legs set very far back on their body, not quite as far back as this, and they generally are not very good walkers. Just more again, because you can see how far back those legs are. I've got this picture here because a common characteristic of the Hesperorniths is that their teeth angle backwards like some snake teeth. This helps slippery fish from escaping, or helps them keep slippery fish from escaping. And the belief is their legs were set so far back on their body that they couldn't walk at all. So I just wanted to show you that penguins, for example, who certainly can walk, when they have to go long distances, instead frequently slide on their bellies. And so the thought is that the Hesperonychs also, when they had to travel long distances on land, if they did, would have preferred sliding on their bellies. When you find their bones, you tend to find lots of them. And so they're thought to have lived in large colonies. And so a made up image, obviously, but you know, that's what you would have found if you could go back in time. And then the last of the three families are the ichthyorniths. And just think of them as toothed terns, and you've pretty much got what they're like. Ichthyornithes, you may think that's because they eat fish, which they did, but it's actually because of the way their vertebrae are shaped. They're very unusual vertebrae, more like a fish's than a reptile's. But I mean, they're toothed terns. That's what they are, and that really sums it up. There were only 2 species that we know of, though they were all over the northern hemisphere and in large numbers. So these birds were very successful. They didn't change much over 30, 35 million years. I mean, the species just hung on. So they were just very, very successful being terns and eating fish and, you know, floating on the water. Very, very advanced in some ways, including having a keeled sternum. This is the earliest bird that had a keeled sternum. I told you there are 2 species. The biggest difference is that they're in size. One is slightly bigger than the other. And I just wanted to show you this to remind you that they lived during the time of pterosaurs, and you know, being kind of gull or tern-like, it's not hard to imagine that they might have harassed some of these pterosaurs. Okay. I wanted to just give you a sense of the diversity of Cretaceous birds, and I'm going to just whip through these really, really closely, really quickly, just to show you the variety of habitats and lifestyles they had. So birds were very diverse in the Cretaceous. There weren't just a few fringy little birds and a few fringy habitats. They were everywhere. So here's an example. Pedagopteryx was a bird that they've got depicted here very much like a guinea fowl, because in all ways it seemed very much like a guinea fowl. They lived on dry open plains. They didn't fly, lived in flocks, but I mean, here you've basically got desert birds. You've got Eunornis, who was a bird who lived on the shores of lakes and probed in the mud to get you know, to get insects and crustaceans. Talk about that. We've got Hongshanornis, which really looks like a plover the way they've drawn it, and very much was like a plover. Their wings suggest they could fly very fast. They appear to be omnivorous. These were wading birds that would probably go a few inches into the water. We can tell that by their legs. The reason we think they're omnivorous is they've got a few teeth, which look like the kind of teeth you have if you eat fish, but they also obviously ate seeds. We found both seeds and fish in their bellies. And there's Ganzen, who was a lake dweller, a swimmer in a lake. And probably the oldest common ancestor of the ichthyorniths and hesperorniths. So this is the ancestor of those 2 families that dominated in the Cretaceous. And again, it's more evidence that the ancestors of modern birds had an aquatic or semi-aquatic lifestyle. This guy really looked like a grebe or a diving duck. So here are 2 images, 2 artists' interpretations. I don't think if you saw this bird, you would have any trouble thinking that it was a modern bird if you saw it. Another desert dweller, so they lived in the desert. There was a bird that, in effect, was a kingfisher. Again, fish in its belly, perching bird, can't walk very well, always found along the shores of rivers or lakes. A zygodactyl climber. Zygodactyl, if you don't know what that word means having a foot like either a parrot or a woodpecker. Most birds have 3 toes facing forward and 1 backward. This guy's 2 and 2. And because he had a tiny little stubby bill, the thought is that it was the functional equivalent of a nuthatch, that it could walk up and down trees, could not walk on the ground very well, probably, gleaning insects. So this is the equivalent of a nuthatch. There's an example of a zygodactyl foot. As you can see, 2 and 2. Not only were, we talked about having a nuthatch, there are also woodpeckers, including sapsuckers. Why do we know this guy's a sapsucker? Look at the funky tail. Sapsucker because a lot of them have been found with amber in their belly, so they're obviously eating sap. Here's a hesperonid. This one lived in rivers, just to emphasize that it's not just the oceans. Some of them lived in very cold. Some lived in neotropical areas, and some lived in very, very cold environments. And then we've got our ichthyornids that were gulls or terns. So just to give you a sense again of just how varied birds in the Cretaceous were. I'm going to take 5 minutes to talk about modern orders of birds that could be found in the Cretaceous. Okay. Where I am. I've lost where my place in my notes. I got to back up a little bit. Okay. All right. Modern birds in the Cretaceous. We're only 100% certain of 2 different types. One type are the waterfowl, and the other type, and there's less evidence for these, but logic tells you there's a little bit of physical evidence. There are a few fossils for landfowl. Logic tells you that if there are waterfowl, there must have been landfowl, because waterfowl are more highly evolved landfowl. So if you have the one, you almost certainly have to have the other. Waterfowl and landfowl, if you don't know, are very closely related to each other. They're in the same infraclass. They share lots of common characteristics. Bulky, heavy bodies, large clutches, polygamy, which is rare, not non-existent, but rare among other birds. The young are very precocial. So let's talk about the kind of waterfowl that existed in the Cretaceous during the Age of Dinosaurs. The earliest of them is a bird called Vegavisks. And Vegavis is from the late Cretaceous. It's essentially a primitive goose. It is in the order of the waterfowl order. It's in the same order as living geese and ducks. About a foot long or so, named after Vega Island in Antarctica. Let's see. Really looked like a goose or a long-legged duck. Though we've never found one, they're pretty sure that its bill would have been like a filter feeder, like a dabbling duck, okay, like a dabbling duck, so it was probably a filter feeder. One thing that was found was its syrinx, okay? Don't have a bill, but we do have a syrinx. Syrinxes are the voice boxes that birds have, and the syrinx is identical to that of a modern goose, so they probably honked. We don't know that, but by looking at the syrinx, they really think that this was a bird that honked. And here's just another image of it. And again, if you saw that fly by, I don't think you'd look twice. Okay. Vegavis is the earliest waterfowl that we know from the Cretaceous. Its descendant was polar ornis. Their remains are found in the exact same deposits as Vegavis, but a couple of million years later. So it's believed that they evolved from Vegavis. These were completely toothless birds, you know, living like a duck. They probably ate fish, probably large invertebrates, and they only are from the southern hemisphere. So these are the southern ecological equivalent of the hesperonids that we were talking about before. Probably flightless because their bones are very, very heavy like a penguin's, so probably couldn't get enough lift to fly. And then their descendants are presbyornis. I really like Presbyornis'. When it was originally found, it was mistaken for a flamingo because of its very, very long legs. It actually comes in 2 different species, one the size of a goose, one the size of a swan. North America, South America, Australasia. So they were pretty widely spread. We do have bills from this bird, and it's very much like a dabbling duck's, though it's got a little hook at the end. A little hook at the end, but it's got a dabbling duck bill. So they were probably filter feeders, and they lived a long time. They started right before, they evolved right before the mass extinction event 65 million years ago. They lived until about 50 million years ago. So, you know, they lived a long time. And here's just a diorama showing one. That's what they probably did. They probably walked around in shallow water. And here's a flock of them. Again, when you find one bone, you find many bones. And so they were probably flock dwellers. Let me go through really quickly. I won't tell you about what they are. I'm sure you know what chickens look like. I said there is fossil evidence, but less evidence for land fowl like chickens and turkeys. This is the best we have. It's called the wonder chicken. It's nicknamed Adelson. This is a bird that may have been the last common ancestor of chickens and ducks. It's a seagull-sized shore bird. Again, our bird ancestors tended to live near the shore. It had features of both ducks and chickens. And so if you look at its skull, you can see it looks kind of halfway between a duck and a chicken. And it's usually described that if you saw it from the front, you'd think you had a chicken. And if you saw a chicken, and if you saw it from the back, you'd think it had a duck. It has a very duck-like butt. So there's one land fowl, galliform, from the Cretaceous. And this is the other one, Washington Ornithological. But this is a very fragmentary skeleton, so not a lot is known about it. Not everybody believes it's a galliform, but a fair number of paleontologists do. So, no Cretaceous remains have been found for ratites, penguins, loons, parrots, raptors, etc. Land and waterfowl are it. Those are the only fossils we have from the Cretaceous. But logic tells us that ratites also lived then, because ratites, which are birds like ostriches or rhea, have a very old-fashioned type of mouth. That's why they're called paleognats. I can show you this. This is an ostrich skull. And look, if you look at the top of the skull, you can see that there are 2 bones separated by a very large space. This is a hawk skull, and if you flip it over, you can see that these bones are fused. Dinosaurs were all paleognats. Classic dinosaurs were all paleognats. Modern birds, except for ostriches and their kin, are all neonats. They look like this. It's pretty inconceivable that ostriches evolved from birds that look like this. They must have evolved from creatures that looks like this, and hence they must have been around in the Cretaceous, though we haven't found them yet. So that's it. Those are the birds, including the modern birds, that lived during the Age of Dinosaurs. Almost all those birds were killed off, with the exception of the waterfowl and the landfowl and the ostrich ancestors that must be there at the big mass extinction event that killed off all the classic dinosaurs. It's no wonder that it killed off all the classic dinosaurs, and it also killed off most of the birds and all the half and half creatures, because there were worldwide forest fires, and there were tsunamis, and there was sulfur dioxide that made the air unbreathable and made the ocean acidic. And then there was a nuclear winter from all the dust that got kicked up. I mean, it's a miracle that anything survived, and almost nothing did. Just a couple of birds that went on to become ducks and chickens and ostriches. So my summary for this talk is that during the Age of Dinosaurs, there were lots and lots of small feathered flying dinosaurs. Okay, you don't have to be a bird to be small feathered and flying. There were lots of intermediary forms with features that were halfway dinosaurs and halfway true birds. Dinosaur era birds filled many, if not most, of the ecological niches filled by modern birds. They were not fringy, they were not rare. Birds were common back then, and they were everywhere. Birds were common. The three dominant families during the Age of Dinosaurs were the enantiorniths with their opposite shoulders, the hesperorniths, which are like loons, and the ichthyorniths, which are like terns or gulls. And the only modern birds that have been found in the Cretaceous are land and waterfowl. So to find out what happens after the mass extinction event, you'll have to stay tuned for next time. And so that's it. I'm done. And I'll take any questions.
Oh, Kim, that was.
Oh, I just ran out of time. I always run out of
Our
time.
heads maybe spinning. And I want to let everybody know that Kim has generously agreed that we can post this recording. And I know I'm going to be back looking at it again and again. It's just such a rich presentation. There have been a couple of questions that have already been put into the chat. And Elaine and I will probably take turns reading these, and I apologize in advance for the massacre of the names of these.
That's all right.
But one of the questions.
I'm going to give you all the hard ones.
Pardon?
I'm going to give you all the hard ones, Vicki. I'm going to read the first one.
I think I might be able to get through.
Oh, you are?
I thought most dinos didn't come about until the crocodilomorphs died out after the end Triassic extinction, so they were pretty limited in range and diversity. Do you have any?
Can you read that one more time? Just read that
Pardon?
one more time.
Yes. I thought most dinos didn't come about until the crocodilomorphs died out after the end Triassic extinction, so they were pretty limited in range and diversity.
Yes. Crocodiles ruled the world before dinosaurs did. The only reason dinosaurs could take over was because most of the crocodiles had died out. That's exactly right. And that's why the first of the three ages of dinosaurs, the Triassic, dinosaurs were small. They weren't nearly as common. They weren't as diverse as they were later on. So yes, that's exactly right.
Here's another question from Steve. I'm confused about the 160 million year ago true bird that you mentioned may have been ancestral to Archaeopteryx, now recognized as a dinosaur. Would this be reverse evolution, birds to dinosaurs?
No. Aornis is a lot more primitive than Archaeopteryx is. So evolution is proceeding in the direction we expect it to be proceeding. The point is rather that as we find more and more of these halfway creatures, we've gotten more and more persnickety about what we're willing to call a bird. So if you look at creatures that were discovered in the year 1920 or the year 1880 or the year 1940, we were more likely to call them birds than if you find the exact same creature today. Okay, so there are creatures that have been found in the past 20 years that are way more modern than Archaeopteryx, but they're called dinosaurs. That's a matter of our labeling, not reverse evolution. Evolution was happening in pretty much in one direction. I mean, it branched out in lots of different ways, but generally you're going from A to B for many traits simultaneously. But no, I don't see any of this as evidence for reverse evolution. More, what is it? Like, again, when you've got a continuously changing trait, like for example, birds in general have fewer vertebrae than reptiles do. But even modern birds all have different numbers of vertebrae. So what's the vertebrae cutoff? You know, is 22 too much to be a bird? How about 20? How about 24? And I mean, there's no God coming down and telling us what the right answer is. And so some paleontologists cut the line here, some paleontologists cut the line somewhere else. But Aornis was definitely more primitive than Archaeopteryx. Both of them would be classified as dinosaurs now. Does that answer the question?
There's a question that I think you already answered at the very end of your talk about why the, and I won't say this right, Enantiorniths birds died out at the end of the Cretaceous if they were distributed.
Yeah, I can be real clear about them. Most, not all as I showed, but most enantiorniths were forest dwellers. When the asteroid hit the Earth, The heat flash was such that there's good evidence, there's good geological evidence that essentially every single forest on the planet burned down. And if you're a forest dweller and the forest burns down, you're going to die out. And the ones that survived were the birds that lived in the ocean or lived in the shore, or occasionally some birds more out in the open that lived in underground insects, because underground insects or underground seeds, because they didn't burn up, so you had a food source. But you know, basically every animal bigger than a shoebox that lived in the forest died. And so that's why the enantiomorphs died. They were small enough to survive, but their habitat just went away.
Vicki, hang on for a moment. David Armstrong. David, you can ask it yourself or I'll read it. Which would you prefer? You wrote a question and you had sent it. I'll read it. David wrote, this was at about halfway through your talk. Since most birds and half and halves went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, do you think one group held a competitive advantage over the other? If there was no mass extinction, which group would have prevailed?
Well, I think that all three of those big families could have made it because they were pretty much non-competing with each other. I mean, you know, you've got your gulls living on the shore, and not too much was competing with them. They were better flyers, long distance flyers than the enantiomorphs, so they could have gone further out into the water rather, you know, than just hugging the shore proper. There were some enantiomorphs that could have done that, though again, most were forest dwellers. The Hesperonychs were living underwater. I mean, they were, you know, they never came to land except to breed. You know, they were either floating on the surface, but mostly getting their food by diving, the way, you know, a loon would or a diving duck would. So they're not competing with the enantiomorphs. I mean, I suspect that we'd still have enantiomorphs because they were so well established and they flew as well as modern birds. They had all different sorts of beaks to get at all sorts of different food sources. The only competitive advantage I can imagine off the top of my head that a modern passerine-like or woodpecker-like bird would have had that they didn't would be that, and I didn't talk about this at all, but it's suspected that modern birds' eggs hatch faster, so they may have had a competitive advantage that way.
Interesting.
But I think they'd still be around. I mean, you know, that massive event was just out of the blue, you know. I mean, if it hadn't happened, you know, there'd still be dinosaurs.
There's another interesting question, again from Glenna. With all these half and half forms with varying combinations of avian features, what was the key innovation that allowed the line that became modern birds to outcompete or at least persist in preference to the other lineages?
That is just a brilliant question, and I don't have an answer for it. I'm sorry. It's a very reasonable question. I mean, it's a great question. And I just don't think anybody knows. You know, I mean, I don't think anybody would dare say.
I'd like to make a tiny content. When you all were out having your dessert or whatever, I was, you know, noshing it with our audience, and Glenna is actually, I hope John won't mind, John is the voice and person behind Glenna, and John is sorry, I'm getting to it where he wrote this in for me. John is a retired museum ornithologist at UC Davis.
Whoa.
And avian paleontology is one of his great interests. So we're so grateful that he came and joined us to add a level of sophistication. Kim, I have a question, and I have a sneaking suspicion I may have actually asked this back in February, but I've apparently forgotten the answer. Why have so many of the amazing preserved fossils come from China? What is it about the geology or the What has been going on there? Is that something that you have an insight
Yeah,
in?
I mean, I just know it in a cursory way, but I know that there must have been some sort of volcanic activity because a very fine ash settled for a very long time over and over again. So that would be consistent with volcanic activity. And so this very fine ash, which for some reason that I'm not remembering, also solidified very quickly rather than staying like fine ash or dust for a long time. So the specimens were really well preserved. And it's a miracle. I'm telling you, because I stay up on this stuff. Every month there's another species or two that they're finding. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. But if you think about a 6-inch bird with hollow bones, or even a 12-inch bird with hollow bones, it's just hard to preserve them for 120 million years. They just don't last. But I mean, there are a few other beds. There's a bed in, I believe it's Chile, maybe Argentina, that's producing some nice fossils. There's one bed in Eastern Europe that's been producing nice fossils, but there's nothing like those 2 Chinese beds. And they're very extensive.
Wow. Well, that really helps to put some light, so to speak, on geology that we just don't have any idea of. Our friend John, the ornithologist, had a follow-up question. He wrote, was it a race to true powered flight? Would that have had a survival value? Maybe.
To true powered flight. True powered flight seems to have evolved multiple times and in multiple ways. So it clearly is an advantage. I mean, it's obvious that there's an advantage to doing it. There are 3 different theories as to how flight evolved, and they're probably all true because flight evolved multiple times. Some creatures, probably, for example, pterosaurs would be like this, that probably glided first. You jump off a cliff and use your wings like a parachute, or you jump off a tree branch and use your wings like a parachute, and only later start flapping. Then there are other birds like cryptovolans, like I showed you, that seem to indicate that flapping could come first. And then the third theory, which is kind of really funky, has to do with the fact that if you hold your wings out and run, you can actually go up a steeper slope than if you don't have your wings out. And the thought is that at least once, flight evolved because young birds would try to get away from predators by running up a tree trunk or running up an embankment and using their wings to get the extra lift, and that's actually the origin of flight. That's a new theory from about 2015, which was actually invented by an ornithologist, not a paleontologist. So I don't quite know how to answer the question. I mean, yeah, there was a race and there were lots of winners because there were lots of niches to fill. And there are many ways to get there to the same place. Anyway.
Kim, I have a question.
Fantastic.
You mentioned that many of these birds were found in many, many parts of the world. And you also mentioned how rare some of these fossils are. How do they have a sense of how widespread these various species were?
Okay, well, some of the species that are really widespread, we've got bunches of fossils for. But if you think about it, it only takes one fossil in a country to know that it was there, right? So, I mean, you could only have, say, 15 fossils of a bird, but if one is from the tip of South America and the other one is from Canada and another one's from Australia, et cetera, you can say, well, this bird was all over the world. So you don't necessarily need to have a real lot of fossils in terms of number in order to know that, right?
Thank you. if anyone else has a question they would like to unmute themselves or add any additional questions into the chat, there are many comments about how much our viewers have enjoyed your presentation. So another thank you.
Well, like I said, it's so cool to me, you know, just most people just have such a misperception about what the skies were like and what the state of birds were, you know, during the age of dinosaurs. I mean, you know, you think of pterosaurs, but you don't think there were birds. You don't realize that birds were around for a good chunk of the age of dinosaurs, that it wasn't just one or two birds, you know, in one or two habitats. They were all over doing almost everything that modern birds do. So it was a very birdie place. So, you know, if you love birds, that's kind of a nice thing to know. You know, they've been around for a long time.
Well, thank you very, very much. I'm so delighted you came back and gave us part 2, and we hope perhaps we can entice you back and see what comes next.
Oh, I'm sure you're sick of me, but maybe in a couple of years.
Thank all of our viewers for joining us, and hope you'll come back on December 6th when we have our annual meeting and awards ceremony, and get to hear from Dennis Paulson about the great blue heron. Wish you all a very good night and hope to see you a month from now. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you again.
Thanks.